There it is. Hello, today I'm interviewing Alondra Bobadilla, the poet behind the poems in the song cycle My Name is Alondra, a piece composed by Omar Nachmi, which I feature in my concert program Through My Eyes, Sounds of the Americas. Alondra is a Dominican-American poet and writer who made history in January 2020 as Boston's first ever Youth Poet Laureate. Born and raised in Boston, her work highlights the power of creative expression as a tool for young people to process emotions and drive social change. She is a published author of the book With Clipped Wings, a collection, a confessional poetry, and journal entries published in June 2021. Hi, Alondra, welcome.
Hi, Fanny. Thank you.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. A very busy week, but I'm doing pretty good.
Wonderful. So the first question I have for you is, what inspired you to compose the poems that made up My Name is Alondra? And what story or emotions were you hoping to convey through these poems? And just want to say, I know these poems weren't written specifically to make up that cycle, but that the composer Omar put them together and chose them for that. But if you could think back to when you wrote those four pieces, maybe separately, um, tell us about your process and what you hoped to convey then.
Of course. So each of these poems were all written in completely different spans of time and in completely different moments. Some of them are titleless, but the first poem, that's actually the title also of the piece, My Name is Alondra. Um, it's actually undergone some edits after I originally, like when I first wrote it. I don't remember exactly what the inspiration was, but I do know that it kind of sounded like an interview, sort of naturally. And I really liked that I guess that vibe in a way that it sounded like I was being interviewed, but I was just interviewing myself. And in general, it came out of this sort of desire to learn how to talk about myself if someone were to ask me. Because when people ask you, well, who are you? I really hate that question because I'm like, well, what do I say? Do I talk to you about my likes, my dislikes, my traumas? I don't know, especially as a teenager. Um, and I was often finding myself at that time because of, the Youth Poet Laureate position, being interviewed or being asked questions about myself. And I was 17. So I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. I'm just now figuring out what I think about myself. And I think I have a pretty good idea. I just didn't know how to encapsulate that into simple words. So instead of coming up with like a 5 second, 10-second elevator pitch or however long it is that people describe themselves, it just came out in the form of a very long, very honest, very transparent poem about all these different aspects of my life that in the moment were really, really important and very essential to who I am, and things that are still essential to who I am, right? So my self-identification, um, my sense of empathy, the fact that I'm a very emotional person, my faith in God, just all of these things that were very essential, my perspective of friendships and the world, like these things that I think about on a day-to-day basis, in and out. I was like, well, this is who I am. If someone were to ask me, I would just give them this poem, right? And this is who I am. So that was the inspiration behind that one. Um, there are two poems in there that are particularly emotional and have to do more with my mental health. Um, and off the top of my head, I don't think I ever titled them. They're just titled by dates and times, and I can't remember them right now. But one of the poems that is more so about anxiety attacks, I actually wrote it, I think, maybe a couple of minutes after having an anxiety attack. So the emotion was as raw as it was coming through. It was a very palpable experience because it literally was 10 minutes after I had just had an anxiety attack. And I wasn't one to journal about my feelings, even though like counseling recommends that. And I did have a counselor at the time. I hated like journaling my feelings, but that particular day, it felt like a necessity to explain what it felt like for me to have an anxiety attack and to process those emotions through words. Um, And I just felt like it would be a perfect piece to share because I think it's very relatable. Or at the time, I felt like it was very relatable. We're talking about a moment where I think a lot of people were experiencing anxiety that otherwise maybe weren't even aware that that was something that they could feel because of the pandemic. I think it's sort of, there was a heightened sense of societal anxiety. So I just felt that that would be a relatable piece for a lot of people to listen to. And then there was a piece that kind of described a lot of my sense of anger and my sense of grief. And again, that was just, kind of encapsulating emotions that were very real for me and very palpable for me in that moment of my life and what I was processing in terms of my emotional identity. And then finally, that piece about my grandma and my aunt, who are two people to me that, I mean, meant the world and mean the world. Um, and sort of, again, kind of talking about emotional identity, but in the context of generational trauma and generational heritage. And again, in the context of grief. So it was sort of like a combination of those other three pieces where I'm exploring themes of self, but in light of family heritage, right? And exploring themes of grief and mental health, but in light of generational traumas. And it was a piece that I never thought I would ever share in any other context. And for whatever reason, I felt very called to it and drawn to kind of proposing it as a possible submission. So I was really happy that those were chosen and that, Omar felt the way that I felt as well. Not that
Yeah.
I did like the other poems that I proposed, but I felt that these three or these four kind of had a um, sort of a threaded connection.
Yes, of course. And there's the second one that you haven't mentioned at length, but the second one is a little bit of, it's lighter and it's reminding yourself of like your childhood friends and how, changes that happened then are somehow still alive in you. And I think when I sing that piece, there's something so childlike but also magical about that. uh Poem number two is just beautiful to step into that character for me, but Alondra for you.
Yeah,
How incredible, right? I think in terms of being a singer singing your poems, it just feels very relatable, and like I can find my well of emotion to bring forth, hopefully for the audience, your feelings. How incredible. Thanks for sharing. Can I ask you, like, where do these poems fit within the broader artistic journey that you've had? And you can share maybe how old you're now and how old you were then to give some perspective for our audience.
for sure. So it's funny because that piece that you mentioned was one of the shorter ones,
Mhm.
but definitely is one of my favorites. And does actually, it kind of fits perfectly into this question about artistic journey. So when I was 17, 16, around that time, so I would say 16, 17, 18, the bulk of my poems were about personal exploration, mental health, and in particular, themes of like nostalgia and melancholy. So there's a lot of like kind of looking at my childhood and sort of reckoning with what those emotions were like at the time versus what I understand now and my perspective well, I say now, right? But now in terms of that time, right? As a teenager, where it was like, it's the first time that you start to re-examine childhood experiences, memories, and you're like, wait a minute, that's not quite what I thought it was. Or oh my God, that's exactly what I thought it was. But now it's even worse because now I understand other things about the world and about my family that contextualize those situations and give it a lot more depth. Even the beautiful ones, even the celebratory moments, even the moments of, childlike connection that even as a teenager, I was re-exploring some of those friendships and relationships, both with the adults in my life, but other children that I grew up with that were no longer children. Right now, we were all either teenagers or young adults. Um, I did have a lot of poems, and in particular, the poems I read publicly were about social issues, a myriad of different social issues. But this particular project more so fell in line with my more intimate exploration through my poetry that had a lot more to do with self-expression and mental health. And that you know, that at that time I wanted to bring more of that work to the forefront instead of what people were used to hearing me read about, which was the external world, more societal, community level concepts and situations. And I
Mm,
kind of wanted to bring some of those bigger societal questions, problems, et cetera, into the intimate space, right? And what that looks like as an individual or like a smaller nucleus experiencing, the impact of these things.
mhm,
So now I'm 22 and I still explore a lot of these themes, but in a very different way. I think I've kind of tapped in even more to themes of nostalgia and melancholy. Um, there's, a lot of poems about, still emotional identity. So I've still kind of continued to explore these themes, but obviously with a different level of maturity. And there's a lot more like looking back and reckoning, and there's a lot more of looking forward and thinking about, you know, kind of the concept of time.
mm,
Um, so that's sort of been the changes there. I talked a lot about time in my older poetry at that time as well, but I think now there is more conversations about time. So these are themes that I didn't think I was going to continue to write about because at the time I sort of saw them as like a venting session, but now I'm still carrying along these themes, but less as a venting, more as like let's break these things apart and re-examine them. Let's re-explore them. Let's put them together in a different way. It feels a little more abstract, if that makes sense.
mhm. Thank you. And it does make sense. With time, things change. Were there any particular challenges that you encountered when writing any of these four pieces? And just so the audience understands this, some of these poems are musically 8 to 10 minutes long. So that's quite a lot of writing. And the shortest one, the second one, is about 2 minutes long, in comparison. So let me know if there are any areas of, difficulties that you encountered through any of them.
So, kind of a hallmark of my poetry is really long poems. And
Mm-hmm.
I heard someone, I think it was around that time period, that there was someone that I actually know it was a little bit more recently. I would say like last year, I was having a conversation with someone who was like, a lot of poets can't get away with long poems because no one's going to pay attention for that long. And that had never really been a problem for me in the sense that I didn't say that to this person because I felt like it was going to come off the wrong way. But I was like, really. But I was like, wow, I knew exactly what he was trying to say, and he was correct in like a general sense. I wouldn't recommend for you to purposefully write a poem that long, but I just could never write a short poem. Like that's why the shortest poem is 2 minutes long, which is that's actually kind of pretty average. But some poets might still feel like that's really long. And I'm like, no, that's really short,
We're
very
just
short.
getting started.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, what do you mean? Like there's so much to say. And my mentor at the time, Portia, who, was the poet laureate for the whole city, the adult version, like I call it, she sometimes would challenge me to like cut some of the poems in half, but sometimes she was like, yeah, I get it. This is just one long thing. Like it can't be cut. Like otherwise it doesn't make sense. And I'm like, you see, like it just doesn't make sense. So I think there was not difficulty in writing it, but there was a sense of difficulty of like, oh, is it going to be too long?
For
Is
the
it,
audience. Yeah.
yes, especially in the form of music. I was like, I wonder how this is going to resonate. So there were some edits, even in terms of cadence. That was my other fear that like the rhythm or the cadence of my poems is very different from, at least at the time, like my perception of what classical music usually sounds like. So
Mm-hmm.
I was like, how is my voice going to translate in a classical composition?
Setting.
I was
Yeah.
like, this is so bizarre for me. I was like, I don't know if it's going to sound right. So there was a lot of tweaking of like language, which I appreciate Omar for so much without removing the authenticity of my voice. But there were moments where certain things had to be tweaked for the sake of the song, and to still get the resonance, the resonance of the message.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was the most difficult part was feeling like, how is this gonna, you know what I mean? How is this gonna resonate? But also the challenge of like figuring out what to edit if there were moments where Omar was like, let's try to edit this, or what do you think about this? Because I was so attached to the work that again I felt like you can't take it apart because then then it won't make sense. You know what I mean? So,
Hmm.
and then finally, just the fear of vulnerability, I think was always sort of in the back of my mind while I was writing, but choosing to share this work was like the fear of is this too vulnerable?
I can tell you it's not. It's just exquisitely perfect
Thank
in
you.
that it hits at a level of understanding that I think everyone can see themselves in that. Even
Thank you.
people that are not actively talking about it, which is even more important. That's the kind of audience member that I look forward to singing for because I think we are doing a service to social communication and expression and healing when
Yes.
we can present our work for people who don't have that avenue of expression in their life or feel lonely and maybe don't have the social connections or relationships to feel safe enough to feel. And I
Thank
think you have done that in these poems. And I'm just thrilled that we have three back-to-back performances for people to experience it. It's very rich. I definitely look forward to sharing with you what people come away with. We have a survey after each concert, so hopefully people fill it out and let us know what resonated, you know?
It's so
And
exciting.
those things that you described being like the difficult parts of the process make a lot of sense. Very human, definitely. Yeah. How do you see this poetry resonating with today's audiences? What do you hope people take from them? I know it's a different time than the one in which you wrote them, but because the song cycle is gonna be continuing to be sung, what do you hope people take away, in the maybe the expand of time um, of its life, you know?
Mm, man, there's a lot of things. I would say I would hope that people would be able to tap into what I had to also dig deep and tap into, which is that vulnerability. Even if it's not necessarily, being shared with others in the scale that I'm kind of putting myself out there. But I truly believe that it is worth putting yourself out there and being vulnerable, even if there might be perhaps some negative consequences to that, if it means being able to show someone else that you can do that, maybe on a more intimate scale, but that you can do that, that you should do that, that it's very liberating, that it's necessary. And in terms of the span of time, since I was a teenager, I often observe that a lot of, older adults, as they kind of like get farther and farther away from that chapter of their life, they sort of, I wouldn't say forget. Sometimes people do forget, sometimes purposefully forget, which I can 100% understand and sympathize with. But also sometimes people distance themselves in such a way from that part of their life that they forget that a lot of what they are now, or even a lot of the sort of the ache or the sense of like longing, yearning, or the sense of like something's missing could actually be coming from things in your childhood or your teenage years that you have forgotten or sort of put on the back shelf. And I say that as someone that has had the pleasure and the privilege of working with people of all different ages and different social settings, whether that was like I spent a lot of time with my grandparents and a lot of times with my elders, and I love hearing them talk about this time in their life. Some of them cherish it, hold on to it, and it sort of grounds them. And that's why they
Mhm.
have such a good sense of self-identity now. The ones that don't tend to have a lot less emotional stability. And that's just sort of what I've observed. Similarly, I work with a lot of teenagers that are now presently teenagers and still sometimes want to distance themselves when they get like 1 year older from a moment in their life that they just experienced. And I think it's because our society, especially here, in the US, but other countries, other places, other cultures can resonate with this concept of like, kids being pushed to be older than they are. And that's so dangerous. So I want people, regardless of all ages, to sort of kind of honor the time that they are living in and experience it to the full, because that's what I did and that's what I wanted to do. And that is healthy. Experience the time in the life that God has given you now to its fullness, so that when you get to the next time, you're not feeling a sense of regret or like you have to reckon with a past version, because that past can stay there, but it can also still, naturally be a part of who you are now.
Wow, what a great message. I'll remember that for the performances. I think something unique that you will have is that you will get to read yourself as a teenager when you're 90. You
I
know,
know.
how amazing.
I know.
I'm thinking now, I wish I wrote more during that time in my life, but you definitely have that. If you could
Excited.
just if you could describe this piece, and by this piece I mean like My Name is Alondra, the song cycle, in 3 words, what would you say and why?
Mm. Vulnerable for the obvious reasons. The content is very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Um, I would say the music adds to that vulnerability for sure.
Hmm.
Uh, Relatable, again, for the sort of for the obvious reasons, common themes that people can experience across cultures, across age groups. It's not, limited just to the teenage mind or the teenage psyche. It's something that anyone can experience at any moment in time, even if their examination of those feelings or those experiences is going to come with a different level of, maturity. And I would say hopeful, because even though some of, you know, the poems are heavier than others, I pretty much finish off all of my poems, even now, still until today, just like then. I try to always fill it up on a hopeful note and not as a cliche. It's not like an inauthentic, oh, I got to wrap this up nicely so that it doesn't feel so heavy. Like what a lot of people don't realize is, even when I was writing that poem about having an anxiety attack, I was feeling the emotions while I was writing it. So while I was getting to the end and the wrap up, it's kind of easier to end on a much hopefuler tone. Um, because at that point the emotions, the majority of them have already been vented out. So you're literally hearing me go through the process of winding down and then realizing like, no, I'm okay. Like it's okay. So that's why I would also say it's hopeful because I feel like even in the heavier themes, there's always room for faith, there's always room for values, there's always room for whatever it is that acts as people's foundation to come back to a state of center.
Oh, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. And I am sure people are thrilled that they could hear you share more about this piece because when they hear the music, this adds depth. And knowing you and who you are and what you're doing and what you're about, it's just really hopeful for, at least for me as a musician and young adult as well. Can I say young?
Yes, you can.
Youngish.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just really great to see you make all these connections and sustain through time your commitment to social issues and in depth in your emotional understanding of all these themes. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Fanny. This was a great conversation, truly a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.